Good evening, Mr. Bond fans. It happened. The cinematic James Bond recently celebrated 60 years of existence. And the anniversary was marked by, I would say, two main events. The release of a glossy new documentary about the music of the James Bond series, as well as a glitzy star-studded concert at the Royal Albert Hall in London, both billed under the sound of 007. I'll get into talking about both of these things very shortly, but first of all, I just want to say that I do really appreciate the very definite focus on the music of James Bond as the focal point of these anniversary celebrations. It has kind of reminded me too of a line that Halle Berry had when she was introducing the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the James Bond series at the Oscars way back at the 2013 ceremony.
Tonight, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of James Bond in motion pictures. We do it with music, which is as inextricably linked to Bond as the martini, exotic cars, and pussy galore.
Eon sure kept that concept in their back pockets for 10 years then. I hope that Halle Berry got credit for this. Whenever it comes to a new Bond documentary like this, for a Bond nerd like myself, and probably yourself as well if you're watching this channel, I go into these things hoping for a couple of things. One, that I'm going to learn something new, or at least hear a different perspective on something that I maybe already know, and then also for the documentary to stand on its own as a film and make me want to revisit it sometime later down the line. And I'm very happy to say that the sound of 007 works really well on both of these fronts. I had an absolute blast with this documentary. I thought that the interviewees that they had were really good, and they had made excellent use of archival footage of people like John Barry who aren't with us anymore. And I thought that the presentation was really excellent, like where they had graphics in places, just the editing. Some of the archival clips were really fascinating, like with Bruce Forsyth introducing the John Barry band on stage. I'd never seen that clip before. I thought that was really interesting. Same thing with Monty Norman being on some variety show and then it cuts to him singing a song. I really appreciated learning more about these guys. Like, I'm not generally speaking much of a music guy. I'm pretty sure I'm tone deaf, so I don't know much about these people, and I felt like, particularly at the beginning where there was a real focus on Monty Norman and John Barry and the Bond theme and the music of Dr. No, I got a lot out of that portion of the documentary in particular. When there are already so many documentaries out there about James Bond, and there's some of the best documentaries on the series were produced for the DVDs back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the John Cork directed ones. Like, those are so definitive, and there was even already a documentary about the music and the sound of James Bond on one of those discs. I can't remember which one now. So for anything new like this to come in and feel like it stands on its own 2 feet and tells a different perspective is really good, and I think that the sound of 007 really does that well. Particularly, as I say, with that whole early chunk where they talk about the James Bond theme itself and Monty Norman and John Barry's involvement in it. Like, that has been a bit of a thorny issue in the past regarding, some legal, disputes that occurred regarding credit and all that kind of stuff. So it's a thorny issue that I felt that the documentary presented really nicely. And indeed, I felt like it had an overall, tone of honesty throughout. In some places, it did have slightly warts and all elements, like when Duran Duran talk about working with John Barry, and I thought that was quite amusing. Duran Duran have some really interesting candor in this. It's always interesting when an officially released product like this can kind of dog on elements of itself. Like, obviously, Eon Productions approved this thing into existence, and yet there are a couple of portions in it where they talk about themes that maybe didn't work so well, and Moonraker is cited as an example of a theme that didn't work terribly well, as is Octopussy's All Time High. And I think it's fair. It shows a clip of Shirley Bassey talking about how she didn't care for Moonraker very much, and it's Tim Rice himself who wrote the lyrics for All Time High, who's kind of I don't think it worked terribly well. So I appreciate that it's the people who were involved in those songs kind of presenting those very honest opinions about it. But I've certainly seen some light consternation online from people who really like those songs. And yeah, when you come to an officially sanctioned released product like that, they dog on the thing that you like, it's kind of it can feel a little bit odd, to be honest. But at the same time, I kind of like that this has that candor to it, and that it isn't just everything's great, everything was wonderful, everyone was wonderful to work with all the time kind of thing, because that kind of stuff can just end up feeling way too overly promotional. I feel like I'm watching a tool of marketing rather than a documentary in its own right, and I think that The Sound of 007 does have a bit of a warts and all feel in places, and I appreciate that a great deal. I also thought it was really interesting that they touched on some unused Bond themes and artists who were in contention to sing Bond themes that weren't used. Like, specifically, Barbara Broccoli recalls a story about meeting Amy Winehouse that is really kind of heartbreaking, and Radiohead are also mentioned, their Spectre theme, and how that didn't end up in the film because they already had the Sam Smith song. They already agreed to that at that point. And it's interesting, I don't know if Daniel Craig talks about being a big Radiohead fan, and I do wonder, there is a slight tone of like, they're all like, God damn it, how did we end up with that Sam Smith song? We could have had Radiohead if we just waited a little bit longer. If I have any nitpicky criticisms about this documentary at all, and hey, it's this channel, obviously I've got nitpicky criticisms, I would say that I wished that the documentary had a bit more of a clear kind of narrative through line through itself. One of the things that I really love about the Everything or Nothing documentary that was released in 2012 is that, as well as telling you about the birth of this film series and all these little factoids about films and the creative people involved and all that kind of stuff, it really did have a consistent narrative through line through the producers. Like, that film is as much about Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli as it is the films, and they are kind of presented as the protagonists in that story. And then you have Kevin McClory and Sean Connery coming in as antagonists, really, and there are kind of dips, and Saltzman and Broccoli falling out and, you know, breaking up their partnership, and then Sean Connery calling Cubby Broccoli when he's pretty much on his deathbed, and you know, the reconciliation that they have as a narrative, much like watching a scripted feature film. There are dips and waves, and I guess for The Sound of 007, I wish that it had something similar. Like, I guess John Barry would have been your main character if you were to go that way with the narrative. And hey, maybe they didn't want this to be the sound of John Barry, but it's difficult not to talk about him an awful lot and his influence. And indeed, he is a big presence in this documentary, and I really like the bit where it talks about how he paid for a page in Variety to kind of signal his breakup, really, with Eon and doing the scores for these films after The Living Daylights. But I felt that structurally, just telling the story of The Sound of 007, it was a bit scatty in places, and it would kind of jump around the timeline. Like, at one point, you're talking about the John Barry 60s work and Goldfinger and You Only Live Twice and all that, and then it just suddenly jumps to modern day, and it's Billie Eilish and Hans Zimmer talking about No Time to Die, and then it goes back to the 60s. In places, I felt like it was a little bit all over the place, and as a result of that, I lost a sense of a narrative, and I felt like I was watching montage. I guess it was kind of like going all over the years. I suppose that's what it comes down to for me. I would maybe have preferred a bit more of a linear timeline, like we start with the 60s and end in the 2020s, and maybe that would have felt a bit checklisty. Like, there are definitely songs in the series that aren't touched on here. Scores, is Michael Kamen even mentioned in the whole documentary? And yeah, I appreciate that you don't want something like this to feel like a checklist of, right, we've got 25 things to go through, and by the halfway point we need to hit film 12 or 13 or whatever. And I know I've seen like tweets that the director of the film has made where he kind of talked about how, there were certain people who either just didn't respond to the invitation to be included, or were supposed to be included but then couldn't be because of travel issues or COVID-related issues and all that. And who knows, maybe we'll get a sequel someday that does touch on some of these things, but in some cases where, like, they have Lulu there. Lulu is included in the documentary, but they don't really touch on the man with the golden gun as a theme in any detail, and it's just little moments like that that feel a little like wasted opportunities. And again, I just want to say that this is nitpicking, because, yeah, you have a 60-year history to fit into a 90-minute film, and sure, you can't touch on absolutely everything in that time. And ultimately what they do touch on is really satisfying, and talking about just the evolution of the sound of Bond and the prestige that comes with it. I love Garbage are there, and Shirley Manson tells a story about how she was offered the song, which is really cute and really nice. And like I say, I like that they're not afraid to touch on potentially thorny issues or criticism, like Jack White in places actually talking about the reception to Another Way to Die. Like, there are points in his little conversation that I felt bad about having dogged on that song for so many years. Probably not bad enough that I'm gonna stop doing that anytime soon, but... And some of my favourite bits in it were really when it was focused on John Barry, David Arnold, Thomas Newman, Hans Zimmer and Steve Mazzaro talking about their scores. And the things in there, like, I never knew that it was, like, actually Billie Eilish's humming, or whatever you call it, vocals, in, like, actually in the No Time to Die soundtrack, like when Bond says goodbye to Madeline. I had no idea that that was her. And things like when they talk about the score music, I think it's the Final Ascent cue, isn't it, where... Bond is kind of going on to having his conversation with Madeline and going onto the roof of Safin's base to die, and how they sort of reworked the Bond theme into that. Like, I'd never realized that, and I came away with an appreciation, actually, of that score that I didn't have before, and some of the more technical aspects that kind of go over my head as something of a musical layman, if you will. Overall, like I say, I had an absolute blast with The Sound of 007. It was a really fun, engaging, interesting documentary. I would highly recommend it. If you have an Amazon Prime Video account, definitely give it a watch. It's an awful lot of fun. I'm really hoping that at some point it gets released on DVD or Blu-ray or something in the future, much similar to the way that Everything or Nothing did. It is a documentary that is going to stand the test of time. Like, I still go back and watch that Everything or Nothing documentary every once in a while. It's just a really, really well-produced film in its own right, and I think that The Sound of 007 matches that, and it's a brilliant companion piece to that documentary as well. And now to talk about The Sound of 007 in concert. Or otherwise known as one of the best nights of my life. This was, of course, a charity concert at the Royal Albert Hall, and it was curated by Bond composer David Arnold, produced by Eon Productions, and it featured a selection of Bond soundtrack artists, including Garbage, Shirley Bassey, and Lulu, and then there were special guests, other singers doing cover versions of beloved Bond songs, and there was the Royal Philharmonic Concert Orchestra performing bits of soundtracks from Bond films over the decades. It wasn't a strictly black tie event, and I must say that I'd only a couple of days earlier returned from a holiday where I was in the US, and funnily enough, ended up going to San Francisco and Las Vegas. It was never intended to be a Bond sightseeing trip, but did a good bit of that anyway. So I was still really jet lagged and a bit hazy, but I put on my black suit and a gold tie because I figured that's appropriate for an anniversary concert. And yeah, it was just an incredible experience. David Arnold himself was on stage for much of the evening, and it kind of worked in an artist would come out and sing one of the songs, and then there would be an instrumental piece from the orchestra, and then an artist would come out and sing a song, and it kind of went along in that format. Shirley Bassey came out first and received, I think it was like 3 standing ovations by the end of it. She came out and she sang Diamonds Are Forever and Goldfinger. Obviously, completely brought the house down. Everyone was kind of there. Like, she's the highlight of everyone, right? Like, singing those 2 iconic songs, and even at, like, what is she now, 85? She is just absolutely brilliant. Though I do have to admit that, being the Brosnan era fanboy that I am, seeing Garbage come out and singing The World Is Not Enough was the peak of the evening for me. I've always really loved that song and that score in particular, and it's just something that you don't ever see. Like, as much as, like, I've never seen Shirley Bassey sing live, for God's sake. Like, this was a out-of-body experience for me, but I've still seen her on TV, like, singing these songs. Garbage, I don't think I've ever seen perform this song live on TV or anything. I'm sure there are clips on YouTube, probably, but to have that experience was absolutely magical and wonderful. Just a brilliant thing to experience. And in terms of original artists, Lulu was also there. She came out and sung The Man with the Golden Gun, which was such a, like, it really did make me want to get out of my seat. And, you know, you're in the Albert Hall, so everyone's sort of sat there. You can tell who the real Bond fans were in the room, because I think we all had massive grins on our faces throughout the whole thing. And the artists who came out to do their own interpretations of the original songs, I thought were largely absolutely fantastic. I mean, Jamie Cullum came out and did From Russia with Love, and he just has that right level of croony kind of voice. It worked really well. Another highlight for me was actually Paloma Faith, who sang Goldeneye, and she was very much channeling Tina Turner in her performance, and I thought she was absolutely brilliant with that. Another real highlight as well was David Arnold singing You Know My Name, and this, like, his explanation for why he was singing it was included in the highlights of the concert that you can see on Amazon Prime. Arnold talks about how he didn't want to exclude the song from the concert, but equally he couldn't, you know, sort of bear to hear anyone else singing that song now that Chris Cornell has passed away. So he sings it himself, and it was brilliant. Like, just the emotion of it really came through, and it's such a rockin' song. And to have that sort of more emotional edge to it, I thought was really special and impactful, and I thought David Arnold just did phenomenally well. And again, just, you know, more praise for the guy, because the whole thing, the curation of the whole thing, the instrumental pieces that were selected kind of blew my mind, in the fact that there was some of the less common pieces. It really felt like the event was curated for the fans, by the fans, with that, in the sense that it wasn't just the scores that you hear, you know, the Bond theme in, because that's the recognizable thing that everyone's gonna notice. There were bits like, they did a cue from Goldeneye, the Goldeneye soundtrack, which is so often dogged on, the Eric Serra soundtrack. They did the piece of music that plays when Bond and Natalia are on the beach quite late in the film, and it was absolutely beautiful. And at one point, I was there with my good friend Sean Longmore, whose artwork you will be very familiar with in the background of many of these videos. He turned to me after that was done and was like, "That's kind of crazy, because how often does that piece of music get played live by an orchestra like this? It does not happen. It's such a rare thing." And similarly, like, they did a cue from Quantum of Solace. It was the from the bit in the film where Bond is infiltrating the opera. And they did a cue from Spectre. Again, just like these soundtracks that I don't think are terribly well regarded in the fandom, and yet David Arnold clearly has such a passion and a love of every composer that has done work for this series. And it was a really good opportunity and excuse to just sit back and listen to these. I don't go and listen to the GoldenEye soundtrack all that much, or the Spectre soundtrack all that much for that matter, and to just sit and hear these pieces of music play by this fantastic orchestra really did give me a new appreciation of it in that setting, in these surroundings. I thought it was a real transformative moment. Really beautiful stuff. The fact that they went out of their way to include some of the more unusual cues in there. They were still, like, you know, they did Bond 77, which was awesome. I also actually really like they did, from The World Is Not Enough, Come In 007, Your Time Is Up, which is the music that plays through the boat chase sequence. And there was that bit, you know, where Brosnan goes underwater and he does his tie and it does that da 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 da. At that bit, like, me and Sean just turned to each other and, like, did that. It was fun. So it's incredibly disappointing then that the version of the concert that went up on Amazon Prime on James Bond Day was less than half of the overall show. Like, don't get me wrong, they will have cut out an awful lot of applause and stuff just to keep things moving. They cut out a lot of introductions. But the fact that they cut out almost every instrumental piece is just, like, I can't believe that they did that. They kept in the one which was really amazing, where Hans Zimmer came on stage and him and David Arnold were jamming to a bit of music from No Time to Die. That was excellent, but I felt like it was such a shame coming out of that event, like I say, feeling like, oh wow, that was really done for Bond fans. Like, your average audience ain't gonna be able to pinpoint where these bits of instrumental, you know, music play in whatever film they're from. I really felt like it was designed to give Bond fans something different and unusual and exciting as a result of that, and to just see that completely wiped out of the the version that went up on Amazon was very, very disappointing. Don't get me wrong, like, it's still great that they put it up there and you can see they even cut out they did oh gosh, I can't remember which singer it was now. Someone came out and did a version of Nobody Does It Better, and that didn't make it into the Amazon highlights package. I don't know if maybe there was just a very strict rule about it having to be under an hour long or something, but you know, I really hope that at some point, all of this was recorded, I really hope that a full version of it is released, because like I say, some of those instrumental pieces were really great, and I want to watch them again. I just really hope that they see the light of day some day. And again, if this were to ever get a physical media release, the documentary being paired up with the full version of the concert on a nice Blu-ray disc, I would consider myself very happy. I don't know if Amazon would do such a thing, because obviously they want people to go to their streaming service, so you got to pay for your membership if you want to see it. But I can hope and dream, and fingers crossed that will happen someday, because as an overall concert, it was a terrific production. Just thank you, David Arnold, so much for doing all of that, because it was just it was an incredible way to mark the 60th anniversary of the series in a live concert format, particularly at the Albert Hall, which is just such a prestigious venue. Just really spot on. Loved it. It was great. Consider me a very happy Bond fan. Does beg the question what the focus is going to be for the 70th anniversary. Hopefully we'll have Bond 26 by then. Who knows? Please do let me know your thoughts on the documentary and the concert in the comments section below. Also below you can subscribe, hit the Mrs. Bell notification button, and find links to my various social media pages. And with all that being said, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.